The story begins with Wosyub, who shouted at Unsu, asking him what he was so busy with that he couldn't answer his calls. Unsu, visibly frustrated, replied that he had told him several times that he had plans today and accused him of seeing someone behind his back. He showed his phone, explaining that he couldn't take so many calls and that, after 2 months, he had finally managed to organize something. He assured that he had been in touch the whole time, but the only time he was distracted was when Wosyub bombarded him with calls. Wosyub, irritable, scolded him for seeming to lose his mind and accused him of talking to him as if he were blind. He then raised his hand, indicating that Unsu didn't know his place. Meanwhile, another person passing through an alley heard the commotion and saw Unsu lying on the ground. The bully, noticing his presence, shouted at him to stop staring, but then turned his attention back to Unsu, about to hit him. It was then that the stranger intervened, asking what he was doing. Unsu, surprised, looked at the newcomer and asked who he was. The bully, with disdain, insinuated that this stranger was the guy Unsu was cheating on him with. The intervening boy firmly reproached him for continuing to speak that way. With a single move, he kicked the bully, throwing him against the wall. Unsu, nodding, told him he had done the right thing. The savior boy took Yunsu's hand, but the bully, after getting up, threatened them that they would not see each other again. After a while walking together, the boy asked Unsu what they were going to do now. Unsu didn't respond, and the boy began to wonder in his mind if he would keep holding his hand. Finally, Unsu, with a sigh, apologized for always ending up with guys like the bully. He told him that his first boyfriend had cheated on him with someone he had introduced to him, the second had broken up with him after saying he didn't want to date a guy, even though he was the one who was desperate, and the third turned out to be his lover, without him knowing. Those toxic relationships seemed to follow him one after another. Referring to the bully from before, Unsu lamented not having seen him coming as an obsessive and violent person. He decided that he wouldn't date anyone again. He looked at the boy who had saved him and told him that he should have gone in another direction, apologizing for dragging him into that situation. He thanked him for helping him get out of there. The boy, with a look of understanding, apologized in return. Unsu, surprised by the hug he received, stammered that he felt he was crossing the line by getting so involved in his life. But the boy told him not to blame himself and to cry as much as he needed. He explained that he didn't have to suffer for someone who didn't deserve it and that, although he didn't know the details, he hoped Unsu wouldn't suffer too much for that person. Unsu, in his mind, reflected on the time that had passed since someone had consoled him in that way. He didn't know the boy, but his hug felt so warm that he couldn't understand why he felt so comforted. Unsu arrived home, closed the door, and collapsed onto the sofa. With a sigh, he told himself, wondering why he had pushed the boy away and run off, why he had cried in front of a stranger. He felt terribly embarrassed and didn't understand why he had let himself be consoled. This is so embarrassing. Why did I let myself be comforted, he thought. He decided he would sleep and forget everything that had happened, at least for that night. The next day, in the school cafeteria, Yumin, a blonde boy, approached Unsu with a worried expression and asked what had happened. Unsu, somewhat tired, replied that he had broken up with Wosyub the day before. Yumin, surprised, exclaimed, "What? What did he do?" Unsu explained that he hadn't been able to do what Wosyub wanted, so he tried to hit him. Yumin, alarmed, asked if he had gotten hurt, to which Unsu shook his head, saying he was fine, without showing any damage. Yumin, seeing his tired face, commented that Unsu looked unwell and asked if he had slept well. "Your face looks terrible," he said with a slight smile, although he noticed that something was not right. Unsu, in his mind, acknowledged that he hadn't slept well at all. Although he had fallen asleep at night, his dreams had been filled with images of the silver-haired boy who had rescued him. He didn't know what to think of all that, but he couldn't get the boy out of his head. And I tell you that the dream Unsu had was one of those +18. Unsu woke up and kept thinking about what had happened, wondering why he had been so clumsy and why he couldn't stop thinking about the incident. He couldn't fall back asleep, and embarrassment washed over him as he remembered how he had let a stranger comfort him. The next morning, Yumin approached him in the cafeteria and asked if he was okay. Unsu told him that although he felt a bit down, it wasn't that serious. Yumin suggested that he take a break, but Unsu insisted that it wasn't necessary and finally said it was almost time for his class, so he said goodbye and headed to his classroom. Yumin, watching him silently, thought that something was not right, even though Unsu was trying to hide it. Upon arriving at room 1320, Unsu wondered if there would be any empty seats in the back. He thought he would probably fall asleep during the class since the lecture would be boring, but soon he spotted an empty seat. He approached the boy sitting there and asked if the seat was taken. The boy replied that it was free, and Unsu felt relieved. However, when the boy took off his cap, Unsu realized it was the same young man who had saved him from his ex-boyfriend. His surprise was so great that he considered getting up and sitting somewhere else, but before he could do so, the teacher arrived and began taking attendance. Unsu, still bewildered, wondered when the teacher had arrived and how he had missed his entrance. As the class progressed, Unsu tried to concentrate, but fatigue was overcoming him. The worst part was that he felt the boy's gaze on him. He looked at the young man and asked if he wanted to say something. The boy pointed out that his eyes looked a bit puffy, which made Unsu remember his dream about him. When he shifted in his seat, he made a noise that alerted the entire class. He quickly apologized, but in his mind, he wondered why he had recalled that moment so suddenly. Finally, the teacher finished the class and told the students they could go enjoy their snack. Before leaving, the boy approached Unsu and apologized for what had happened earlier. Unsu, feeling nervous, replied that it was fine, but the boy, concerned, said he had been quite worried after the incident. As he walked away, the boy looked back at Unsu and thought to himself that his face was really red. Unsu, seeing him walk away quickly, felt relieved, thinking that maybe the boy hadn't taken him for a fool. When he was finally alone with Hejun, he thanked him for his help, although Hejun replied that it wasn't necessary. Unsu, feeling somewhat indebted, joked that he wanted to do something to show his gratitude. Hejun suggested that maybe Unsu could buy him lunch. Unsu, somewhat surprised, thought to himself if he had really asked for that. He reflected on the fact that he had done all this without thinking too much, but concluded that since Hejun was popular, he probably did everything without giving it much importance. Finally, they would tell them the name. Kim Hajuan, a 21-year-old young man, had met Seo Unsu, who was a year older than him. During an initial conversation, Kim politely asked Unsu to speak to him in a more relaxed manner, given that he was younger. Unsu, somewhat surprised, decided to follow Kim's advice and speak to him more comfortably, calling him hyung, which is a respectful way to address an older person in Korean. At the end of the day, they both arrived home. While Unsu was checking his phone, he found a text message from Kim asking if he had arrived home safely. Unsu, somewhat surprised by Kim's kindness, began to reflect on the situation. In his mind, he thought that despite being a popular and attractive person, Kim seemed genuine and like a good person. This made him feel uncomfortable, but also intrigued. He decided to look for more information about him on a campus social network, where he found several comments about Kim, some talking about his kindness and others mentioning his popularity. Unsu, a bit embarrassed for having searched for information about Kim, tried to calm himself but couldn't help thinking about the possibility that Kim might be interested in him. Later, Kim sent another message saying he wanted to spend more time with Unsu, which prompted Unsu to call Kim to confirm that he had arrived at the meeting place. When they met, Kim appeared quickly, even though Unsu had told him to take his time. The two exchanged phone numbers, which allowed them to get even closer. Kim, with his charming personality, always seemed to talk to Unsu consistently, which left Unsu feeling confused. Although Kim didn't seem to have any unusual traits, Unsu compared him in his mind to a puppy, someone affectionate and close. During their meeting, Kim offered Unsu a coffee and asked if he had a lot of work pending. Unsu, somewhat nervously, mentioned that he had homework to do in the library, but also had a date that night with a friend named Yumin. During the conversation, Kim asked more about Yumin and his relationship with Unsu, which made Unsu feel a bit uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Yumin, who was worried about his friend, observed Kim from his point of view. Despite his concern, Yumin couldn't help but think that Kim seemed different from the people Eun-soo usually associated with. During dinner, Yumin joked about how close Eun-soo seemed to be with Kim, suggesting that there might be something more between them. However, Kim denied having a girlfriend, which surprised both Eun-soo and Yumin. Yumin, realizing that Kim might be interested in Eun-soo, thought that things could become more complicated. Despite everything, Eun-soo tried to maintain a relaxed attitude, reminding Kim that if he ever started dating someone, he should let him know so as not to interfere in his relationship. The story of these three characters, filled with misunderstandings and possible unexpressed feelings, was beginning to take an unexpected turn as each of them dealt with their own feelings and concerns. After a while, Kim Ha-joon asked Yumin about Eun-soo. Yumin replied that he had gone to the bathroom, and upon noticing that Kim called him Sunbae, he asked him to call him Hyung as Eun-soo did. Kim accepted, without much interest. Yumin, in a serious tone, mentioned that if he spent a lot of time with Eun-soo, he would probably have to contact him at some point. He then handed his number to Kim, who, after receiving it, joked that Yumin hated him. Yumin, maintaining his composure, continued talking about Eun-soo. He mentioned that if Kim had helped Eun-soo with Shin Woo-sip, he had probably seen all of his story. Despite Eun-soo having been involved with several people in his past, Yumin hoped he wouldn't get hurt again in the future. At that moment, Eun-soo appeared, apologizing for being late. Yumin, who had only gone to get food, said goodbye and returned to his apartment, warning Eun-soo and Kim to be careful. Eun-soo, not understanding much, said goodbye to Kim, and they began to walk together. While they walked, Yumin asked Eun-soo if he had mentioned that he would be going to a group interview. Eun-soo confirmed that he had and explained that he was going to conduct a preliminary survey for the interview. Yumin commented that Kim Ha-joon was in the same group, but the rest of the classmates hadn't shown up or hadn't responded to the messages. Eun-soo, a bit discouraged by the situation, sighed, and Yumin encouraged him to keep going. The conversation changed topics when Eun-soo asked if everything was going well with Kim Ha-joon. Yumin, somewhat puzzled by the question, replied that he didn't know why Eun-soo was asking. Just then, Kim Ha-joon appeared, greeting both of them enthusiastically. Yumin, with a smile, said that they always seemed to run into each other at that time. Eun-soo, somewhat annoyed by their constant banter, couldn't help but complain about the situation. Later, at a restaurant called Sabor de la Casablanca, Eun-soo commented that in the end, the other classmates hadn't arrived. Kim Ha-joon nodded, knowing what was happening, but Eun-soo tried to keep his spirits up, saying that the food was delicious and that the owner of the place was nice. Despite the situation, he mentioned that they could have the group interview there another time and suggested that they set a date for it. Kim Ha-joon casually asked if Eun-soo had plans for later. When Eun-soo replied that he didn't, Kim suggested going out for a while, as it would be a shame to end the day like that. Eun-soo, after thinking for a moment, happily accepted, feeling that he had made a good decision by accompanying him. After dinner, Kim Ha-joon and Eun-soo headed to the cinema to watch a zombie movie. While watching the screen, Kim Ha-joon noticed Eun-soo, who looked quite scared, and commented that he had chosen the movie because he wanted to see it. However, seeing Eun-soo trembling, Kim Ha-joon thought to himself that he was enjoying watching the movie despite the fear Eun-soo seemed to be experiencing. As the tension increased on the screen, Kim Ha-joon felt intrigued by Yoon-soo's expression, who seemed so focused on the plot. He wondered if Eun-soo saw him only as a dongsing, which made him question whether he would ever be seen differently by him. As the fear escalated, Kim Ha-joon decided to take action, saying out loud that he was also scared and asking Eun-soo to lend him his hand. Eun-soo, without hesitation, agreed, and their hands intertwined in the darkness of the cinema. At the end of the movie, Eun-soo exclaimed that the film had been a lot of fun, although he admitted that he hadn't seen much because he kept turning his head out of fear. Kim Ha-joon, smiling, commented that Eun-soo hadn't stopped turning his head throughout the screening, but Eun-soo replied that even though he hadn't seen it completely, he still enjoyed the experience. After the movie, Eun-soo asked where they would go next, and Kim Ha-joon suggested going to the arcade. Eun-soo happily agreed, and they both headed to the place, but as they left, they began to notice that the rain was falling quickly. Eun-soo, surprised, mentioned that he hadn't heard anything about the rain, and Kim Ha-jun, worried, exclaimed that they would get completely soaked if they didn't find cover. Without thinking twice, Kim Ha-jun covered Eun-soo with his jacket to protect him from the rain, a gesture that made Eun-soo blush, who thanked him for it. Kim Ha-jun suggested that they go to his room, which was nearby, to take shelter from the rain until it passed. They both began to walk quickly toward there, feeling the closeness between them as the rain fell harder around them. "You all know what's going to happen, wink wink." Upon arriving at Kim Ha-jun's house, Eun-soo commented that they were both completely soaked from the rain. Kim, noticing the state of his friend, offered to lend him dry clothes and suggested that he take a shower. Eun-soo, concerned about Kim's well-being, asked him to shower first since he was also cold. Kim replied that it was no problem, as there were 2 bathrooms in the house and he could use the other one. Eun-soo accepted the offer, and they both separated for their respective showers. While Eun-soo was showering, he couldn't help but think about how unexpected it was to be in Kim's house. He was surprised by how spacious it was for a college student living alone. He wondered if he lived with his family, although he remembered Kim telling him that this was his room. After a while, Eun-soo finished showering, and when he came out, he saw that the clothes Kim had lent him were outside. He approached them and commented on it, but Kim, hearing him, quickly came out to meet him, surprised that he had already washed up. As Eun-soo tried on the clothes Kim had left him, he realized they didn't fit him quite right and asked if he had anything smaller. Kim, with a smile, asked him to wait a moment while he looked for something more suitable. In the meantime, they both settled in to share some drinks, toasting to the day. Eun-soo, with a tired smile, told Kim that he had done a great job during the day, but Kim replied that he had also done his part. Eun-soo, however, didn't feel as productive and mentioned that he was very tired. Kim suggested that if he was exhausted, he could sleep and save the drinking for later. However, Eun-soo, feeling that it had been a long time since he last drank, insisted that he needed to sleep but also wanted to enjoy a drink. Curious, Kim asked him if he usually didn't drink, but Eun-soo didn't offer much more explanation, as fatigue was starting to take its toll. They both shared a moment of tranquility as the conversation faded, lost in their thoughts and the warmth of the moment. Eun-soo, looking at Kim Ha-jun, began to explain that it wasn't about that, but rather that his ex-boyfriend didn't allow him to go out to gatherings, which had limited him a lot. Upon hearing this, Kim Ha-jun enthusiastically told Eun-soo that he could drink as much as he wanted, and that he would take care of getting him everything he needed. Eun-soo, surprised and grateful for the gesture, couldn't help but smile and say out loud that Ha-jun was the best. The warmth and kindness of Kim made him feel more comfortable, and a sense of relief washed over Eun-soo. After that, Eun-soo overindulged in his drinks, causing Kim to struggle with him, and during that struggle, Kim's little friend popped out. Well, Eun-soo didn't miss the opportunity and started eating a lot of ice cream. Wink wink. After enjoying the food at Kim Ha-jun's house, Eun-soo was chatting when suddenly the doorbell rang. At that moment, a young woman entered and, upon seeing Eun-soo, asked who he was, suggesting that he might be a friend of her brother from university. The girl, with a confident attitude, introduced herself as Haeoling Kim, Ha-jun's younger sister, and asked Eun-soo to treat her more casually. Eun-soo, somewhat surprised, didn't know that Ha-jun had a younger sister and mentioned that it was the first time he had heard about her. Haeoling explained that they didn't usually talk much about their family to others, and Eun-soo thought to himself that, luckily, he didn't know anything about it since he was feeling a bit down. While Kim Ha-jun was serving the food, he asked his sister why she was there, telling her to eat quickly and leave. Haeoling, surprised, asked why he was acting strangely, mentioning that he hadn't even called her the day before. Then, she asked Eun-soo if something had happened, but he simply replied that he didn't know. Kim Ha-jun, annoyed by the situation, told Haeoling to be quiet. After the meal, Haeoling expressed how much she had enjoyed the food, but Ha-jun, in an irritated tone, reminded her that their house wasn't a restaurant. Eun-soo, with a smile, also commented that the food was delicious and that he thought the same. Suddenly, Haeoling asked an unexpected question: if Eun-soo and Ha-jun were dating. Kim, noticing Yunsu's expression, quickly clarified that he was just joking. Haoling, surprised by Yunsu's beauty, joked again, saying that she thought he was her brother's girlfriend since she didn't know him and found him very handsome. Kim Hajuan, visibly embarrassed, covered his sister's mouth with his hand to prevent her from saying more strange things. Eun-soo, somewhat uncomfortable with the situation, decided to leave, thanking Hajuan for letting him sleep at his house. He said goodbye to Haoling before leaving her puzzled by his sudden departure. As he left, Kim Hajuan asked his sister with a hint of frustration, "Why?" Later at home, Eun-soo was feeling sad and was also giving himself some affection in his own way. Eun-soo, sitting on the sofa, thought about what had happened in the past few days. He wondered if it had all been a matter of curiosity. He knew that Hajuan was one of those people who took on responsibilities, even if he didn't like them. He thought that if he overstepped, it would be better to correct his behavior rather than regret it later. Meanwhile, in class, Kim Hajuan observed Eun-soo, who looked sad. To himself, he thought that everything had started from that day. The situation seemed to have changed. Now, Eun-soo was avoiding him. The morning had started happily, but the moment he opened his eyes, something had changed. As breakfast went on, Eun-soo tried to escape, and Hajuan, determined, decided that he needed to talk to him about it that very day. Determined to understand what was happening, Hajuan approached Eun-soo and told him to wait. Eun-soo, uncomfortable, tried to evade the conversation, saying he had to leave quickly, but Hajuan insisted. He asked why Eun-soo was acting that way and if he was busy. Eun-soo tried to make excuses, but Hajuan wouldn't let him escape easily, asking him not to avoid him this time. Eun-soo, visibly nervous, explained that he didn't think he was good for Hajuan, that his presence could interfere in his life, and that he felt he didn't deserve to be close to him. However, Hajuan didn't understand the reason and asked him if he wanted him to have a girlfriend. To that, Eun-soo, confused, replied that he would leave first. A few days later, Eun-soo was sitting at Yumin's house, deep in thought and still bewildered by his father's recent visit. He didn't understand how he had ended up there, especially after having moved several times without him knowing anything. While reflecting on the encounter, the doorbell rang, and Yumin entered, concerned about his state. Eun-soo, with a dull expression, let Yumin in and explained that he didn't know how to handle the situation. He asked if Yumin knew that his father was coming, to which Yumin, confused, replied that he didn't. Eun-soo scolded him for not having said anything earlier, and although Yumin tried to comfort him by suggesting that he help him face the situation, Eun-soo reacted angrily, saying it was his problem and that it wasn't Yumin's place to make decisions about his life. Despite Yumin's good intentions, Eun-soo rejected him, feeling that he was treating him like a child, and asked him not to act as if they were family when they weren't. Yumin, a bit hurt by Yunsu's words, tried to calm him down, but tensions rose. Finally, Eun-soo, frustrated, decided to leave. In Yumin's house, Yumin's parents also noticed Yunsu's behavior, and he explained that he had to go. His father, confused, asked where he was going, and Eun-soo replied that he wanted to return home. It seemed that Yumin was not willing to accompany him. Yumin's father, worried, asked why his son had come so suddenly, while Yumin's mother murmured that maybe he was there to take him away. The atmosphere was tense, and Yumin's father asked Eun-soo if he was okay, trying to understand why his visit had been so unexpected. The mother, visibly upset, expressed her disapproval, but Eun-soo, determined, insisted on leaving, asking them to call Yumin before he went. Meanwhile, the conversation between Yumin's parents continued, hinting at the tension that existed between Yumin's family and Yunsu's complicated situation. Eun-soo left the house, his mind filled with thoughts. He was overwhelmed by the problems he had faced over the weekend and knew he would have to think carefully about what to do once he got home. He didn't want to be alone, but he saw no other option. As he walked, he thought about how he would face everything that was coming his way. It was then that Kim appeared and called out to him, asking him to come along. They both headed to their rooms, and Kim noticed Eun-soo, who seemed distracted. He said, with a mix of curiosity and concern, that was why he had come back so early. Eun-soo apologized, explaining that he intended to go home, but felt that if he stayed alone, he would get lost in his thoughts. Kim, determined to help him, offered comfort during those difficult moments, assuring him that he was there for him. Eun-soo, feeling a bit more relieved, thanked him and admitted that he felt much better. The conversation continued, and Kim mentioned that he had heard Eun-soo had lived with Yumin before. Eun-soo, not showing much emotion, explained that it wasn't anything bad, but it wasn't easy either. He recalled that his father always saw him as a nuisance, scolding him and sighing around him. The relationship with his father had never been good, which led him to live with Yumin. Kim, curious to know more details, asked him to tell him what had happened, to which Eun-soo decided to recount a story that occurred 7 years ago. At that time, Eun-soo was with a friend, and while they were talking, he realized that something strange was happening. Eun-soo asked his friend about two people, Yoon-jong and Suho, and his friend, with a playful attitude, began to suggest that they could go alone without them. Eun-soo, trying to keep the situation light, replied that it would be best if everyone went together another time. However, his friend's attitude changed, and he began to say things that bewildered Eun-soo. He asked strange questions about what Eun-soo would do if he really wanted to go out with him, but Eun-soo was not willing to take it seriously. The atmosphere became tense, and Eun-soo, feeling that the situation was complicating, tried to end the conversation. At that moment, something strange happened. Eun-soo noticed that something or someone was watching the conversation. His friend insisted, and while Eun-soo tried to avoid the situation, he saw Yumin hiding among the bushes. The tension grew, and before he could do anything, a car arrived, and Eun-soo, upon recognizing it, realized it was his father. Surprised and somewhat nervous, Eun-soo faced his father, who looked at him disapprovingly. Yun's friend, scared by the father's appearance, tried to escape quickly, saying goodbye in a hurried tone. Yun's father wasted no time and began to scold him about the situation, saying that if his mother found out what was happening, things would get even worse. Eun-soo tried to defend himself, insisting that they were just friends, but his father was not convinced. According to him, in the eyes of others, it seemed like there was something more between them. Feeling the pressure, Eun-soo apologized to his father, knowing that he couldn't change the way he saw him. Eun-soo left the place, thinking about everything that had happened, when suddenly Yumin appeared. Without thinking, Eun-soo saw him and called out in surprise. Yumin, with unusual energy, took Yun's hand and suggested that they run. Eun-soo, bewildered, tried to process the situation, but before he could say anything else, the two boys quickly moved away, leaving Yun's father completely confused. A little later, they arrived at Yumin's house. Yumin enthusiastically announced to his parents that he had brought a friend. Eun-soo, still surprised by everything that was happening, asked Yumin why he had brought him there and why he was introducing him as his friend. Yumin's mother, seeing Eun-soo, greeted him kindly, but with a curious look. When she asked if Eun-soo was Yumin's boyfriend, Eun-soo, still confused by the situation, responded in astonishment. Yumin, somewhat embarrassed by the question, interrupted his mother and asked her to stop making assumptions, suggesting that they head to his room. Eun-soo, still not understanding what was going on, remained silent, while his mind was tangled with so many unanswered questions. He sat down, somewhat uncomfortable, and Yumin began to ask him if he had eaten, but Eun-soo didn't seem focused. Instead, he started thinking about his own father and what might happen if he found out about his escape. Yumin called him several times, making sure he was listening. Eun-soo finally asked him why he had brought him there. Yumin, without hesitation, replied that he had been too naive to follow him without asking, implying that he had simply done what he wanted. Eun-soo, not knowing how to react, asked for a clearer reason. Yumin bluntly explained that he had hidden near the wall to avoid being seen by Yun's father, who, in his opinion, had scolded him for his confession. At that moment, Yumin, who had witnessed the situation, had taken the opportunity to run. Eun-soo, still perplexed, asked if he had heard the entire conversation they had. Yumin, a bit embarrassed, admitted that he had, but assured him that it wasn't intentional. Despite everything, he tried to calm Eun-soo, telling him not to worry, that it wasn't a big deal. Yumin, in an attempt to make himself understood, confessed that he was also like him and that he liked boys, trying to ease the tension. However, Unsu couldn't help but feel frustrated. Not only because of the situation with his father, but also because he felt that Yumin didn't fully understand what he was going through. He tried to explain that his father was no joke, that what he said about him and his identity affected him deeply. Despite his efforts, Unsu felt as if he was always the one to blame, and he couldn't bear that feeling any longer. Yumin, seeing him so upset, quickly calmed him down, asking him to relax and take it easy. Although his friend was trying to help him, Unsu couldn't shake the feeling that things didn't fit together and that maybe they would never be the same again. Unsu was at Yumin's house when Yumin's mother called both boys to come out for lunch. She had received a call from the teacher. Yumin, upon hearing this, responded indifferently, while his father, in a stern tone, reminded him that he shouldn't skip the makeup classes. Unsu, hearing the reprimand, felt a chill, thinking to himself that Yumin's father was really strict. Yumin, with a mischievous smile, complained about the situation and told his father that he didn't want to go. The father, visibly frustrated, began to cry and exclaimed that, despite both of them studying well, something about his son's attitude worried him. Yumin's mother, remaining calm, intervened with an ironic smile, suggesting that maybe Yumin wasn't studying as well after all. Yumin, seeing that the conversation was not going well, tried to defend himself, saying that at least he was living well. Meanwhile, Yumin's mother served the food, and seeing that Unsu was enjoying it, she asked if he liked it. Unsu, still somewhat distracted by the family dynamics, smiled and nodded, saying it was delicious. The mother, noticing the relationship between the boys, commented that it was clear they were different and, curious, asked how they became friends. After a while, the meal ended, and it was time for Unsu to leave. Yumin, already outside the house, offered to walk him home. Unsu appreciated the gesture, but assured him that he knew the way from there. Despite this, Yumin insisted on accompanying him. As they walked, Yumin apologized for what he had said about his father, acknowledging that he had spoken poorly. Unsu, with a calm smile, replied that he had been paying attention and understood that sometimes things could seem worse than they really were. Finally, before saying goodbye, Yumin wished him to see him the next day at school. Unsu, with a friendly smile, responded with a bye and continued on his way, thinking about everything that had happened that day. Unsu looked at himself in the mirror, deep in thought. Although he had called Yumin in advance, he still wondered if he was upset about something. While reflecting, he carefully opened the door and heard voices coming from the living room. It was a conversation between his father and mother. His father said in a frustrated tone, "I don't know what to do with him. There was no way I could handle it. I don't know what to do." The mother, visibly upset, responded with concern, "Right now? Thank goodness, he's okay. What are you going to do if something happens to him?" The father, with disdain, said, "Don't you care about your son? But whatever happens to him, I don't care." His father's words echoed in Yunsa's mind, leaving him with a mix of confusion and sadness. After that incident, Unsu remembered how, despite everything, his relationship with Yumin had changed for the better. Over time, they became friends. Unsu was surprised at how he could trust Yumin in a way he had never managed with other friends. Although Yumin often kidnapped him to spend time together, he didn't mind. It seemed that Yumin dragged him into new adventures, but what really kept him close was that Yumin's house became his only safe haven. A place where, at least for a while, he could escape from the problems that haunted him at home. After that, Unsu recounted that his parents had a very intense argument, and the topic of the fight was that Yunsa's father was neglecting the family because he was focused on the business, and the other topic of discussion was that Unsu liked boys. Unsu remembered the night his mother left home. To avoid his father, he went to Yumin's house, who fortunately allowed him to stay. Not long after, his father arrived with the news of his divorce. Neither his mother nor his father wanted to take responsibility for him, so he stayed there, at Yumin's house. Returning to the present, Unsu explained how he had started living with Yumin's family. He mentioned to Kim that it wasn't exactly a happy story. Kim had asked him to tell it, but he was concerned that Eun-soo had been so alone all that time. Eun-soo assured him that he was fine now, although even after talking about all that, he still didn't understand what his father was thinking. Eun-soo considered reaching out to his father, feeling that if he continued to avoid him, it might bother Yumin's family. He decided he would do it the next day. At that moment, Yunsu's father was at home when he received a message from his son that said, "See you tomorrow." And well, that night, Eun-soo and Kim were mischievous. You all know what that means. Deliciousness everywhere. Later, they were on a bus. Eun-soo thought to himself that he was going to die. He wondered if Hajun was really human. Kim Hajun, with a smile, replied that of course he was. Eun-soo questioned in his mind whether he should really go to the gym. Kim Hajun announced that they had arrived at the station and that they needed to get off. When they arrived in front of Yunsu's house, Kim Hajun commented that this was his house. Eun-soo thought to himself that it had been a long time since he had been there. He wondered if he still lived there, and if everything would be okay. He told himself not to get too nervous. Kim Hajun took his hand and assured him that he would be fine. He told him not to be so nervous and that if he had any issues, he should contact him immediately. Eun-soo replied that he would. Once inside the house, Eun-soo followed his father, thinking that everything was like before. He felt something strange. His father told him not to talk about that topic there and asked him to come in. Eun-soo, somewhat uncomfortable, nodded. As he entered a room and sat down, his father commented that he hadn't changed much and asked if something was bothering him. Eun-soo replied that a lot of time had passed and that he felt a bit strange. In his mind, he thought that everything was very awkward since he had never really talked properly with his father and didn't know how to start. Yunsu's father asked how he had been during that time. Eun-soo responded that he was fine, thanks to the good treatment from Yumin's family. The father expressed that he was glad to hear that. Eun-soo, however, thought that his father hadn't come to greet him but for something else. He asked why he had suddenly appeared. Yunsu's father explained that it was because it was time to go home. He said he couldn't stay at someone else's house for too long and that the things that had previously been bothersome had been resolved, so he wouldn't have any problems returning. Eun-soo, surprised, asked if that meant he had to go back. At that moment, Eun-soo remembered when his father left home. Eun-soo told his father that he didn't need him. The father replied that he didn't work on things that weren't necessary. Eun-soo, confused, asked what that meant. The father explained that, regardless of the sympathy they might have for him, raising someone else's child wasn't easy. There had to be a reason to do it voluntarily, and he had given money to take care of both. Eun-soo, surprised, asked what he meant by that. The father, with a tone indicating that it was the first time he had heard of this, said he was glad to know that he hadn't been neglected. He then began to explain that the reason they were kind to him was that there was something in it for them and that he hadn't had time to take care of him. As he said before, taking care of someone else's child wasn't an easy task, so he shouldn't feel too sad. Eun-soo, bewildered, asked why he was telling him that. The father told him that he thought he should have already heard it, and that among those related by blood, he had no choice but to be a stranger. He asked him to think that things would eventually return to their place. Here is the translation of the provided text into English. Meanwhile, Kim Hajun was thinking to himself about when Eun-soo would arrive. He wanted to see him soon and decided to go buy an umbrella to wait in front of his house. When he saw Eun-soo, he greeted him by saying, "Hyung, I was just about to pick you up." But upon noticing that Eun-soo looked sad, he realized that something had happened with his father. Kim Hajun told Eun-soo that it hadn't been a conversation. He just wanted to express what he desired regardless of what Eun-soo wanted. Eun-soo, aware of the situation, admitted that he didn't have high expectations, but he still felt something. Kim Hajun continued, pointing out that the other person had never shown their face before and was now coming to talk in that way, questioning the importance of money since they had never done anything that Eun-soo truly wanted them to do. Eun-soo, accustomed to the dynamic, commented that he had always been the type to dominate the conversation and had just said what he wanted, thanking Kim Hajun for being angry. Kim Hajun, concerned, asked if Eun-soo was really okay. Eun-soo, with a tone of uncertainty, confessed that he didn't know how he felt. Even though Yumin's family had welcomed him kindly, even if his father was paying them, he felt relieved not to be a burden. He had always regretted that they had to spend so much money because of him. However, he recognized that it wasn't easy to treat someone like their own child, and although everything seemed to fit, he wondered why he still felt this way, as if he wanted to sink. Kim Ha-jun reflected in his mind that for Eun-soo, who couldn't easily trust others, that environment would have been more difficult. He realized that Eun-soo saw himself as a burden that others had been forced to bear. Although he didn't know the whole story, he believed that Yumin was a good person. He then asked Eun-soo if he was going to go back to his father, to which Eun-soo replied that he preferred to live alone since he already had a home. He acknowledged that it would be difficult to see Yumin's family again. Kim Ha-jun remembered that when Eun-soo wasn't around, Yumin often gave him warnings. Eun-soo, surprised, asked if Yumin had hit him, to which Kim Ha-jun clarified that no, but he was very angry. Eun-soo mentioned that Yumin had told him that he was now part of his family. Kim Ha-jun suggested that it would be good for Eun-soo to talk to Yumin about that, as it might make him feel better. Eun-soo hesitated, mentioning that he had said some harsh things and wondered if Yumin would respond if he called him. After a while, Kim Ha-jun asked if he still hadn't gotten a response. Eun-soo, distracted while looking at his phone, apologized for being too focused on the screen. Kim Ha-jun asked him to only look at him from now on. Eun-soo remembered that they were supposed to watch a movie, and while they were watching it, Kim Ha-jun noticed that Eun-soo really liked it. He thought that maybe it would make him feel better. At least, that was his hope. At that moment, the movie got a bit steamy, which made both of them playful as well. Wink wink. The next day, the doorbell rang, and when Eun-soo opened it, he found Yumin. He asked if Eun-soo had eaten and if he hadn't starved to death being alone. Eun-soo, surprised, replied that he had never starved and that he hadn't been alone. Yumin, with a tone of disdain, hinted that Eun-soo had been with that slippery Kim. Eun-soo, somewhat annoyed, asked why he disliked Ha-jun so much. Yumin confessed that he hated all the guys Eun-soo had met. Eun-soo, defending Ha-jun, reminded him that thanks to him, he was able to contact him and asked him to stop secretly bothering him. Yumin, in a warning tone, mentioned that he had only told Ha-jun not to do anything stupid. Eun-soo, confused, wondered why Yumin was going so far. Yumin, without hesitation, asked if it bothered him that he interfered in his relationship. Eun-soo, hesitating, clarified that it wasn't that, and asked if he had ever felt that he had bothered him. Yumin, sincerely, confessed that since Eun-soo had arrived at the house, he felt like he was gradually taking things away from him, that Eun-soo shared things with him that used to be only his, and that despite that, he never complained. Eun-soo, grateful but saddened, wondered why Yumin had done that, hinting that his kindness might have been out of compassion and pity for him. He didn't want to be a burden. Yumin, surprised, assured him that he had never thought of him as a burden and that he had never taken care of him against his will. He just wanted him not to feel alone and truly wished for him to trust his family. Yumin took Eun-soo's hand and told him that unless he didn't like being there, he shouldn't say he was a nuisance or that they weren't a family. Eun-soo, feeling overwhelmed, apologized. Yumin, worried, asked him not to cry, as it was hard for him to bear. Eun-soo, wiping his tears, mentioned that he had run into his father while arguing with Yumin. Yumin, surprised, asked if something had happened. Eun-soo, still emotional, affirmed that he was fine but wanted to check one thing. Yumin, intrigued, asked what he wanted to check. They both headed to talk to Yumin's parents. Yumin's mother, seeing Eun-soo, told him that this was what she had said. Eun-soo nodded, confirming her statement. Yumin's mother continued, assuring that it was true. Yumin's father, incredulous, questioned how he could say that. Eun-soo, in his mind, reflected that yes, it was true, and he felt overwhelmed by the situation. At that moment, Yumin's mother took out a card and handed it to Eun-soo, explaining that it was a bank account. Eun-soo, confused, asked why she was giving it to him. Yumin's mother asked him to look inside, told him to accept the money, but never to use it. This means that all the money Eun-soo's father sent to Yumin's parents, they did not use it, which means they really cared for Yunsu out of pure affection. Yumin's mother commented on Yunsu's real father, pointing out how selfish he was, always doing things his way and not accepting no for an answer, which had led to things ending up this way. She thought she should have given that information to Unsu later. Then, she turned to him, acknowledging that he must have been confused to hear that without them saying anything, and felt sorry for making him nervous. While hugging Unsu, she asked him not to cry. Yumin, visibly upset, exclaimed that it was his mother's fault and questioned why she had to say it that way. That night, Unsu called Kim and expressed his happiness for having resolved the misunderstanding. He mentioned that he had been nervous for no reason. Kim Hajun, recognizing the difficulty of putting all that trust in them, reminded him that it wasn't easy to do. Unsu, feeling that Kim was too much on his side, told him that he was always pampering him. Kim, with a smile, assured him that he would love him even when he was too spoiled. Unsu, laughing, told him he was saying something wrong, but Kim insisted he was serious. Unsu, grateful, confessed that thanks to him, he was able to be brave that day. Without his support, he wouldn't have been able to confront his father or trust Yumin. Although it wasn't completely over yet, at least he wouldn't let himself be influenced when talking to his father. Kim assured him that he would do well. Unsu, determined, told him that he needed to talk to him about something. At that moment, Yumin appeared and asked what Unsu was doing out there. Unsu, in a hurry, replied that he was on the phone and would be right in. Unsu told Kim Hajun over the call that he was sorry, but he had to go inside now. Kim, wanting to hear more of his voice, asked him not to be disappointed and to send him a message. Unsu promised he would. After that conversation, he headed to see his real father. Upon arriving, his father commented that he was sure it was the same amount he had deposited. Unsu firmly replied that he was there to return the money and that he didn't want to go back to that house. The father, accepting his decision, assured him that he wouldn't force him anymore. Unsu, feeling a bit worried, thought that his father had just given up. He then asked if he could ask him a question. The father, surprised, asked if he had come for that and if he was curious. He clarified that he hadn't come to look for him at first, as he was now of legal age and just wanted to talk about the child support payments. Unsu, in his mind, reflected that as he had expected, there was no way his father just wanted to see him. The father continued, explaining that when he stood in front of the door, he had a change of thought. He said he had given that money to provide him with a good environment, but suddenly he thought that would be an excuse to bring him back. He then confessed that he had had problems with Yunsu's mother and that it hadn't been his fault. Despite not being perfect, he thought it was an opportunity for both of them to be a family again, but he assumed he had failed. Unsu, sincerely, told him that he had indeed failed, but that he had met people who truly cared about him and that he now had a new family. The father, with disdain, stated that he didn't need what his own father called a perfect family. Unsu, determined, assured him that he was now happier than ever and that he should please let him go. The father, with irony, commented that at this rate, he would also ask him to change the family registry. Unsu, without hesitation, expressed that he would like him to do that and promised that he would send him the money when he went to the bank, asking him not to return it, please. The father handed Unsu a credit card and told him to take it with him, assuring him that he didn't have to pay the money back. Unsu, hesitant, tried to refuse it, but the father insisted that he was just giving it to him and that he shouldn't worry, as he wasn't even going to use that as an excuse. With a simple "see you," the father said goodbye. Unsu, feeling that the conversation had come to an end, replied with his goodbye. As he left, Unsu reflected on what had happened. The moment he stepped out of the house, he felt that the weight that had burdened him for so long had disappeared. He felt relieved, and in his mind, there was only one thought that excited him. It was the certainty that he was the one who had allowed himself to do all of this. Unsu ran into Hajun and greeted him enthusiastically, exclaiming his name. Kim Hajun, seeing him, was happy and asked if he had had a good conversation. Unsu, hugging Kim, assured him that he had done a great job and that he had missed him. Kim, with a smile, replied that he had missed him too. Then, a voice interrupted, reminding them not to play innocent, hinting that there had been a lot of Mamerto Perez, which caused laughter among them. After that, Eun-soo and Kim Ha-jun went camping. As they walked, Eun-soo thought that he still wasn't used to being loved in that way and that he was filled with fears, but he felt that if he was with Kim, somehow they would make it work. With determination, he told himself in his mind that he loved him and that they would be okay. Later, Eun-soo shared that now that they had finished all the paperwork, they were going to celebrate a march in which they would both take their first steps as a couple. At that moment, a person with a microphone addressed the guests, wishing the couple a bright and happy future together. He asked everyone to send lots of congratulations and support, and enthusiastically announced that the groom and groom could march, wishing them a good life. With that, the story came to an end. The end. Thank you for watching.